Come now to this really glorious ending of Zechariah chapter 14, really the culmination of Jewish hope for their Messiah, as we see it here. We as church-age believers have a little bit more of God's progressive revelation that extends into the eternal state. But for the Old Testament saint and for the Jew, this is the culmination. This is the end of history as they know it and they understand it. This is the coming of the Messiah, is what I've titled this. And culmination of the whole book, really, particularly since chapter 12, since he's been discussing the remnant restoration of the king and restoration of Israel. My outline for this, kind of extensive because there's so much in here, but in verses 1 and 2, we see a siege. Just got one word outlines here. Verses 3 through 8, I call that rescue. 9 through 11, kingdom. 12 through 19, nations. And 20 and 21, Jerusalem. Siege, rescue, kingdom, nations, Jerusalem. Let's take a look at the siege in verses 1 and 2. The day is coming for a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you, he's addressing Jerusalem here, will be divided among you. Could be addressing Israel specifically, but I think in the context here, he's speaking to Jerusalem. And he opens, I think, graciously here with a reminder or an assurance that even though there's going to be severe words coming about the end of history, there's also going to be a great blessing that will be there in the end. As you look at verse 2, notice what it says. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured. This is the Lord doing this. This is God doing this. Sometimes we have two sides of history. We can look at history from an unbelieving perspective and understand that what's happening in history may be just the conflict of nations, the normal course of history, or we can look at it from eyes of faith and see it through God's eyes. And he shows it to us here so that we have the same perspective that he has, that he does this. He is at work and he is gathering the nations. Exactly how he does this is, I think, illustrated or illuminated, maybe is a better word, in Isaiah 10, particularly verses 1 through 19, and also in Revelation chapter 17, verse 17. And what we see there is we see the Lord working in the minds of sinful people to do sinful things. So that is what he's doing there. He is not the cause of sin, but he is releasing their sin to have its impact, to have its result. So he is not himself causing sin, but these sinful people and sinful nations want to do sinful things to his city because they hate him and they hate his people, and he allows them to do that. Look at verse 3 then. They're released, they pursue their sinful ends, and what happens is the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. So this is Jesus, the Messiah himself, coming to the rescue of his people. I think, in my opinion, as I've told you before, he's already saved the tents of Judah, as he talked about in Zechariah 12:7. I think he's already done that. And now his feet are going to stand on the Mount of Olives. So he is going to come from that area called Basra in Jordan today, and he will come and rescue his people. He will fight those nations that are capturing, plundering, and even ravishing the women of the city and its inhabitants. And, recently, recording this in December 2023, last October 7th, we saw Hamas attack kibbutzim in southern Israel. And we saw what capturing, plundering, and ravishing looks like today. We can only guess what this might look like when it's unleashed on God's holy city. So Jesus keeps his promise to return to the Mount of Olives, and the Lord returns there from Basra and with the church, so we'll be with him at this point, and he brings the attack to an end. We see some of how this happens later in the chapter. We also see in verses 4 and 5 a discussion of the topographical changes that are going to happen to Israel after the end of that battle of Armageddon, after that final battle. There's going to be numerous topographical changes that happen to the land. I think this is the start of what Daniel describes as a 75-day interim period where the kingdom is being established, kind of a transitional period from the end of the war to the establishment of the kingdom, and that's what we see here. It's part of that. We see also some of the topographical changes discussed in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, where it says that Jerusalem is going to be lifted up. I take that as literal. Verses 4 and 5 discuss those topographical changes. Then verses 6 and 7 talk about what I'd say cosmic changes that are associated with Jesus' return. So not only is the earth going to change in preparation for the kingdom, but the cosmos in some ways are going to be changing as well. And it seems to me as I read this, seems to be kind of a return to the conditions that existed before day 4 in creation, in the creation account in Genesis chapter 1. Day 4 is where God made the sun, moon, and stars, and they became the illumination of the earth rather than himself. And it seems like we're returning to that state. Personally, I haven't studied this enough to know, is that going to be perpetual through the time of the Messianic kingdom, or is this just during that transition period or even less? So maybe that would be something you could dive into and leave a comment or send me an email. Let me know what you find out. Verse 8, we see this perpetual flow when it talks about living water. That's what it's talking about there, is not stagnant water, but a fountain, a always renewing fountain or a quickly flowing river that's going to be flowing toward the Mediterranean and toward the Dead Sea. I think this is going to be a constant provision of moisture that is going to support the incredible fertility that the prophets talk about during this Messianic period. Particularly if you want to dig into this a little bit, Isaiah 27 verse 6, 35 verses, really the first 7 verses of the chapter, and then Isaiah chapter 9 verses 13 and 14 talk about this incredible fertility that's going to accompany the Messianic kingdom, and that's going to be fueled by this constant source of water coming from Jerusalem. Verses 9 through 11, this is the section on the kingdom. And I think verse 9 follows that 75-day transition period. And this is the uncontested, I think, rule of Christ. Notice how it says there, in that day the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. All the land will be changed. So again, we're talking about these cosmic changes, these earthly changes that are going to accompany his kingdom. And again, I'd send you back to Isaiah chapter 2 to see the beginning of these things. But I want you to point out here is just a word of comfort, perhaps, that how the city that had been so severely besieged and abused in verse 2 has now become what it says, a place of refuge, a place of safety. Look at verse 11. People will live in it. There will no longer be a curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in security. So in the presence of the Messiah, this city that was an object of wrath has now become a place of refuge and security. And just a reminder, I think, to us in the church age, the closer we draw near the Lord, the closer we are to Jesus in our behavior, in our personal life, in our devotional life, the better equipped we are to dwell in peace and security, even in the crazy world that we live in today. Jesus promises to be, and his word promises to be, the stable rock, that if we build our house on that, we will not be shaken by everything that's happening around us. We see the nations in verses 12 through 19. We see first Israel's enemies are devastated. Verse 12, we see physical devastation that comes upon them. Talks about their flesh will rot as they stand on their feet. This looks like just a sudden overcoming. This is how Jesus liberates Jerusalem back in verse 2. There's a tendency sometimes, especially among people like myself who is a dispensationalist, to sometimes sensationalize these things, talk about coming nuclear war and that sort of thing. Possibly, but I'd be careful. I'm always cautious about sensationalizing verses like this. It's not the sensation or the sensationalism that we want to depend on, but it's the truth of these words that God is going to do something sudden that's going to utterly, physically devastate his enemies. Verse 13, we see not only physical devastation, but there's going to be war that's breaking out among these coalition of nations that combine to attack Israel. Look at the irony here that those nations who combine to attack Israel, upon attacking Israel, suddenly turn on each other. And then note carefully again that this is the Lord that has gathered them together. This is the Lord who destroys. Again, for those with faith, without faith, this may seem just another set of geopolitical occurrences, but for those of us who are seeing this through the eyes of faith, looking at it from God's perspective, we see that his strong arm is being flexed here. As we go on in these verses, we see not only physical devastation, we see not only war breaking out among the coalition that's come against Jerusalem, but we also see that the wealth of the nations are going to be transferred to Jerusalem. We're talking about a massive transfer of wealth here to God's people. It appears in verse 14 to be financial wealth, gold, silver, and garments. These are what the ancients traded in, but also consumer goods as well. In verse 15, mules, horses, camels, donkeys, all the cattle will be in those camps. It's all being transferred to Israel. Verses 16 to 19, we see the people of the nations that were defeated are going to worship God. So again, those armies were devastated, but the people of those nations survived, and they are going to be worshiping the Messiah. Sometimes even, it says in verse 18 and 19, under compulsion. As we read these things, keep in mind, they're not being converted. They're not Jewish proselytes, nor, in my opinion, are they part of the church at this point. Instead, there's going to be this new order of worship that incorporates some aspects of Old Testament worship. Here we see the observance of the Feast of Tabernacles. If you look at the end of Ezekiel, chapters 40 to 49, there's always also going to be a temple in place and some aspects of temple worship. It'll be similar to the Old Testament worship, but not the same. Similar doesn't mean same. Some people stumble over that, but they will be worshiping the Messiah in these last days. You know, I think this also helps explain Peter's outburst during Jesus' transfiguration. You might remember that when Peter saw the transfigured Lord on the Mount there of Transfiguration, he burst out in Matthew 17:4. He said, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll make 3 tabernacles here. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." Well, I think Peter was thinking clearly, but with a little bit too much anticipation. I think Peter clearly saw Jesus in his glory, anticipating his coming kingdom. And Peter thought the kingdom was here. Peter thought the kingdom was now. And he was offering to build these booths in order to house these first three members, these first three people who showed up here. I think Peter is responding to what we see here in Zechariah. So he was good intention, Peter, but you were just a little ahead of the Lord there. Not quite time for the kingdom to come. Just a preview. We come to the end of the chapter. Really glorious thing here. We see the holy city. It has such a long and checkered history, really, a cursed city in so many different ways that has had a varying relationship with the Lord. And here we see it completely set apart. Everything in the city, bells on horses, cooking pots, bowls, they're all going to be holy to the Lord. Even the most mundane and commonplace thing will be set apart. So what a wonderful Edenic future the Lord has planned for Israel, has planned for his people. And we're going to participate in that, brothers and sisters, as members of the church. We are going to have a role to play in that coming kingdom. And I pray that this anticipation of the kingdom, this picture that's painted here, may serve to help us today, right now, prepare our hearts and our minds for his coming, to be anticipating not only the rapture of the church, of course, his glorious appearing of our great God and Savior, but also the coming, his second advent, his second coming that will follow by 7 years or more, the rapture, that we would be living in light of what's coming here. And we could stand on this stable rock of anticipation as storms break against the visible church today, and as you are well aware, not only his visible church as a whole, but as storms break against each one of us as we endeavor to live as faithful members of Christ's household. God bless you.